Hey guys, Diamond here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. And today, this is going to be our very first video that we're recording for the YouTube channel. And I hope that you guys are just as excited and ready for this as I am. This has been something that I have been wanting to do for a really long time. It's something that I put a lot of time and thought into, and it's something I really hope that we can all start growing together and we can make this into an amazing opportunity for us to go over cases that are from all over the world, not just the United States, everywhere. Cases that you guys feel like you've never really seen videos on, even for us to just cover everything that we possibly can and learn stuff that maybe we don't even know. Because I'm sure like many of you guys who are probably finding my YouTube channel right now are just like me. You're true crime junkies, and you probably could spend hours upon hours researching and looking into all these cases that we're going to cover on this channel and learn just so much. And like if there's a case that you guys know or you see that you guys want someone to cover that you've never really seen done before by other true crime YouTubers, I want you guys to be able to post and recommend that case for me. So with that being said, linked below in the description box, I'm gonna have sources from where I got the information from for my case, to where you guys can go out and do your own research, because I want you guys to all be able to go do your own research and see where I got this information from, and keep an open discussion in the comments. Let me know if there's something that you guys found out that maybe I missed, or something that one of the sources that I have didn't give me. You know, for us to have an open and honest discussion about how we feel about the cases that we're going to go over in the comments below. And also below, I'm going to have links to my Discord, which is going to be my personal Discord. So it's going to be the place where you can come if YouTube doesn't send out a notification and you want to know the first time I upload a brand new video on YouTube. It's also going to be the place that I stream on Twitch. It's also going to be the place for if you want to be able to see that. You can go on there and it'll post every time I go live. It's also a place for my community to come together. It's also going to be another place for us to be able to have these open discussions about things going on in the world, cases, true crime cases that are going on, even just the normal everyday stuff that's going on in your life. If you need somewhere to talk to, I want us to have an open, honest community for us to all communicate together. Like, I just want us to all be able to talk, become friends, get to know one another, build everything together. So with that being said, we're just going to jump into today's video. And today's video is going to be on the infamous killer, Jeffrey Dahmer. And I just want to get this out there. If you guys see me like looking down or looking to my side, that's because I'm looking at my notes. Jeffrey Dahmer was born Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, and he was born on May 21st of 1960. And he was born to the parents of Joyce Annette Flint and Lionel Herbert Dahmer. And he was born at the Evangelical Deaconess Hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And he was the firstborn of two sons to Joyce Annette and her husband. And at the time of his birth, his father was a student at the Marquette University, working towards his degree in chemistry, and his mother was a teletype machine instructor. So it has also been claimed that as a child, his parents did not have a lot of time for him. And that's due to his father always being gone at school and trying to get his degree finished. And then there's also the fact that his mother had a lot of problems. It's been claimed that, you know, he was deprived of it from attention as young as being a baby, as young as being an infant. But there's also other sources that I've looked at that state that he wasn't, and he was actually doted on hand and foot by his parents and given plenty of attention and love and everything any kid would need. So, I mean, we have to look at it from that way. It's kind of like he said, she said. We don't know whether or not he was actually, you know, waited on hand and foot, or if he wasn't, because just he said, she said. So we can only assume that once we kind of start going through all the case, you'll kind of see that it's very likely that I personally believe that he was not doted on or given as much attention as he probably should have been as a child. That's just my opinion, and I believe that maybe he probably could use a little bit more attention and maybe even some more supervision by his parents, because there's honestly a lot of things that he should have not been able to get away with, but he was able to. And you'll see as we go into this case further of the things he was just able to continually get away with. With those other sources that stated that he was waited on hand and foot by his parents and he was given everything, they also say that his mother was known as being tense and greedy for both attention and pity, and she was also argumentative with her husband and also their neighbors. So, I mean, we also have to take that into consideration, that his mother was known as being very tense, which can only mean that, I mean, she probably was not the easiest person to get along with. Once again, just my opinion. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know his mom personally, but stuff I've read shows that she was very her way or the highway, kind of, sort of, in a way. So, pretty much as Jeffrey entered the first grade, his mom began to spend more and more time in her bed recovering from an illness that she stated as weakness. And his dad's studies kept him away a lot of the time. So in first grade, Jeffrey was pretty much kind of in a way left to fend for himself because his dad was away at school and his mom was recovering from weakness. And it's also stated that whenever he came back from school, that Jeffrey's dad was also demanded by his mom to give her all the attention whenever he came home. So in first grade, how much attention did Jeffrey really get if his dad was away majority of the time for his studies, and his mom kind of was just like, whenever you come home, it's about me, not about nobody else. Forget everything else. It's about me. So, I mean, in that aspect, I can see where it kind of seems like, at least from the time he was in first grade on, his parents really didn't devote much time to him. So how did that affect him? I mean, I guarantee you it wasn't easy growing up being super young, first grade. I mean, that means he's what, like 6 or 7 probably? His parents aren't paying any attention to him. His dad's constantly at school. His mom's recovering from weakness. It's only understandable that I'm sure that he got away with a lot of stuff that a first grader should never be able to get away with. He was probably able to do pretty much anything he wanted. And I think that partially played a little bit of a effect on how he became what he became. Because, I mean, starting from a young age, he was barely supervised, at least from first grade onward. So that's just that's ridiculous. I don't know any first graders now or ever in my whole life that were just able to kind of, whatever, do whatever you want. That's crazy to me. So it's also been stated that his mom pretty much all the time worked herself into some sort of state of anxiety, and it was always over these very small little matters that honestly shouldn't cause anybody anxiety, but they typically caused her a tremendous amount of anxiety. And it's also said that she did this just to get a reaction out of her husband. So pretty much to constantly have the attention put on her directly was the reason why that she constantly did this and made herself get so worked up to where her husband would stop paying attention to whatever else he was paying attention to and put it right back on her. So she was pretty much an attention seeker the whole time Jeffrey was growing up. So once again, how much attention did he really get from his parents if his mom was constantly demanding attention from his father? So That's not really fair to any kid growing up to not get attention the way they should. Not that I'm making excuses for the stuff that he does, because he does some pretty messed up stuff. Very messed up. So then, pretty much, because of that, also it should be noted that right around this time as well, his mother also attempted to kill herself and overdose on some prescription pills that she was also known to be abusing at the time. So, with all this going on in the background of his life, it's very well could be understood as to why Jeffrey did not get very much attention from his parents. It also has a very good reason as to why it has been stated from other sources that his dad and his mom did not give him a lot of attention. I mean, how can you, once again, not making excuses, but how can you give a child attention if you as a parent are constantly trying to make sure that your significant other is okay? I mean, if she's attempting to kill herself, I'm sure that his father was trying to make sure that she was stable enough to be there for the boys while he was away at school doing his education and getting his degree in chemistry, which also I believe plays a factor into how Jeffrey got away with the things he was able to get away with. So we'll get into that in a minute. So then it's also been stated that whenever Jeffrey was a little boy, he was known as being very much energetic and happy as a child. He was also pretty much just a typical kid whenever he was younger. He was always known to be very happy, energetic, you know, just a typical little kid. And then after that, he was notably subdued due to him having to have a double hernia surgery whenever he was only 4 years old. Right before his 4th birthday, actually. So, I mean, once again, having that can seriously hinder a child, because, I mean, he was literally having to stop being as active as he was after this surgery that he had to have. How much could he actually do as a kid whenever he was subdued after having to have this major surgery? So, I mean, take that into consideration as well. I mean, he did not, after everything I've read on Jeffrey Dahmer, he definitely did not have a very good childhood growing up at all whatsoever. I mean, it just kind of seemed like one thing after another kind of just went off the rails. It just never seemed to 100% play out in his favor. And then it also was stated that once he got to actual like elementary school, he was also known to be very quiet and timid, which we can also kind of once again go back to the fact that his parents never really gave him attention, and he also had to have major surgery whenever he was young. So, I mean, all those things I think kind of played in a factor in the way he acted as a kid at a young age. And it was even said that one of his teachers sensed that he was neglected at home and kind of made note of it for him. So in a way, like, she noticed that he was being neglected due to his mother's illnesses. But regardless of all that, Jeffrey still managed to have a very small amount of group of friends. They were kind of like a very close-knit, very small group of friends that he had. And from a very early age, it's also stated that Jeffrey was obsessed and kind of manifested an interest in dead animals from a very young age. At first, he started collecting large bugs and insects, such as like dragonflies and butterflies, and he kept them in jars. Kind of like the little mason jars that you can get like jelly and stuff in, if your parents don't make that stuff homemade. I don't know if anybody does. And then it was also stated that later on, after he collected the bugs, he started to collect animal carcasses from the side of the road. And he sometimes even did this with one or two of his friends. He was also known to dismember the animals at either his home or in the nearby woods behind his house. And according to one of his friends, Jeffrey had dismembered these animals and stored the parts inside of jars inside of his family's tool shed. And he kind of explained it off as like, oh, I'm just curious of how all these things fitted together. I just want to know how they all intersect and connect. So kind of like played it off as being like, oh, I'm a curious kid and I want to know how these things work. It's also been said that he decapitated a carcass of a dog, nailing its body to a tree and impaling the skull on a stake beside of a wooden cross in the woods by his house, behind his house, like somewhere around his area. And it's also been said that his obsession with these animals and all this stuff and everything and bones and kind of everything he was obsessed with at that time could be connected to the fact that his dad, sorry to Jordan, might have begun where his dad had removed animal bones from underneath their house whenever he was 4. And according to his dad, Jeffrey was, as he said, oddly thrilled in the sound that the bones made, and he became preoccupied with those animal bones. And his dad even said that he occasionally searched for the bones, like more bones and more bones underneath and around his house. So it's kind of like from this point, whenever his dad discovered these bones, is the minute Jeffrey's obsession with knowing how these animals were all like connected together and like how they all became one object, I guess you could say. So and then after that, in October of 1966, his family moved from Milwaukee, where they originally lived, Doylestown, Ohio. They relocated because his dad earned his degree and he started to work as an analytical chemist in Akron, Ohio. And actually at this time is whenever his mom, Joyce, gave birth in December of that year. So literally 2 months after they moved to Doylestown, his mom gave birth to his younger brother. And Jeffrey was actually allowed to pick the name of his baby brother, and he named him David. So I mean, at this point, I guess you can say like his parents were more, I guess, involved in his life, I guess you could say, because his mother allowed him to pick his little brother's name. And I mean, I think that maybe at this point his parents kind of maybe started paying a little bit more attention, but then I think after his little brother came around that they probably started worrying about him more, and once again Jeffrey kind of fell under the rug. That's just my interpretation, maybe. Yeah, that's just like my interpretation. I'm not saying that that's 100% fact, but after the research that I've done and stuff I read, I want to say that I think that's what happened, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't know for sure, but that's just my opinion. And then in 1968, they moved again, and they relocated to Bath Township, Ohio. And then 2 years after they moved there, while they were having a family dinner, Jeffrey had asked his father what would happen if he placed the chicken bones from the chicken they were eating inside bleach. And his dad at the time was kind of worried about his son, but also at the same time he kind of looked at the strange questions Jeffrey was asking as scientific curiosity, because he was a scientist and chemist. So his dad was kind of like, oh, he's showing interest in what I like and what I went to school for and stuff I know about. So his dad actually in turn showed Jeffrey how to safely bleach and preserve all the animal bones he collected. And Jeffrey started using these techniques in his bone collecting that he did as a child. So now once we start getting into the murders, you will kind of see his dad in a way taught him how to do the things he did in the murders, in a way. So we have to make sure that we pay attention to that and take that into effect whenever we're thinking about this case, because in a way his dad helped him get away with everything he got away with for so far. So then by this point, Jeffrey is now going into high school at this point. So from his freshman year at Revere High School, Jeffrey was seen as an outcast. He would never really fit in with any one group of people. He was not, a part of any big group. And at 14 is whenever he began drinking beer and hard liquor. At school, in school, before school, after school, pretty much anytime Jeffrey could drink is whenever he was drinking. And it was also stated that he even told a kid whenever they caught him drinking that he referred to the alcohol he was drinking as his medicine. So I think that should also be noted as well. That plays a huge fact in the way someone acts. Alcohol inebriates people and makes people act differently than maybe they would in a normal situation. So that's something that we also need to take into consideration too. Like, he started drinking from a very young age. Like, 14 years old, I don't even know what person possibly was drinking it. Like, I didn't even start thinking about drinking until I was at least 18. But while he was also in school, and even though he didn't really talk, he was very uncommunicative. In his freshman year, Jeffrey was seen by all of his teachers and the staff at his school as being polite and very intelligent, but he only had average grades. I believe that that's pretty much because of the fact that he was drinking all the time and he couldn't use his brain the way it should be used because he was drunk and he was drinking all the time. And it was also stated that at this time he was also a very keen tennis player and he was very good at tennis, and he even briefly played in school's band. So I mean, it's not like he completely went his whole school year without trying. I think to try and at least fit in a little bit, I think he may have, but I just don't think it actually worked. And it's also to be noted that whenever Jeffrey was in school, he was also known to be a class clown. And a lot of the students in school, whenever they would do anything crazy or like prank somebody or something, it was also known as doing a Dahmer. And even though he was regarded as a loner during this time, or an oddball amongst most of his friends, he pretty much was known for doing these elaborate pranks and trying to make people laugh. And this included him simulating epileptic seizures or cerebral palsy while they were at school or even at local businesses around town. He was known for being this prankster who constantly wanted to be like the center of attention, but also at the same time he was a loner and he didn't really talk to anybody. So it became very well known that if you did something crazy, it was doing a Dahmer. After this moment, whenever Jeffrey reached puberty, he realized he was gay. But he did not tell his parents. Because also we have to think about this time, this is what, at least probably the early 70s? Maybe, yeah, probably. Early 70s. At this time. And he literally, I can honestly say that in that time, it probably would not have been very accepted by his parents at all whatsoever. So he didn't tell his parents, I'm sure probably out of fear of rejection, and also that maybe he just wanted to keep it his own business because he didn't want anybody to think there's something wrong with him, So in his early teen years, he had a very brief relationship with another teenage boy, but they never had any type of sexual relationship during that time. And in his later admissions, later on in life, Jeffrey stated he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a completely submissive male partner. So in his early teen years, he admitted that at that time, right around right after puberty, probably I would probably guess that this time was. He later stated that during these times is whenever he began fantasizing about controlling a male partner, completely controlling them and not allowing them, I guess, to do anything except what he wanted them to do. And it's also known that as he began to think about these fantasies, they also gradually became associated and intertwined with the dissection that he was currently already doing with the dead animals and the carcasses he found on the side of the road and everything. So that's something that you need to consider as well. So when he was about 16, Jeffrey conceived a fantasy of rendering a particular male jogger unconscious, because he found this male jogger to be attractive, and then he wanted to make sexual use of his body. So he dreamed of knocking this man unconscious while he was running on a run, and then he wanted to literally rape him, pretty much. This young man that we are currently looking at right now, this is 16-year-old Jeffrey. I'm assuming, I would say he's probably about, in this picture, he's in like his, probably around the age of this time, honestly. So around this time, Jeffrey, at this young age, this is actually a year older than what he was whenever this fantasy started. He is 17 in this photo. So the year before this photo was taken, he was fantasizing about rendering a particular jogger unconscious because he wanted to rape him. And even on one of these occasions, he concealed himself in a bush with a baseball bat, and he laid there waiting for this man to pass by. And luckily for this man, on the day that Jeffrey was laying in wait for him, he did not decide to go on a run that day, in which case very well may have saved his life and kept him from being sexually assaulted by Jeffrey Dahmer, which is crazy to me. Like, crazy. And this actually would be known later on in life by Jeffrey to be known as his first attempt to attack someone. He was only 16 years old at the time of this attack, well, attempted attack, because the jogger never came by. So then by 1977, his grades had already declined majorly. He was failing school, and so his parents hired him a private tutor with very limited success, because once again, he was drinking. I mean, there's only so much you can do with someone who's drunk pretty much 24 hours a day at the time. And that's something too, like, look at this. I mean, if you look at him on this picture, you can't even honestly tell. Like, I'm just looking at him, I would never know that he's drunk. But I mean, I guess that's kind of what happens with people who abuse alcohol. They become someone you can't even tell that they're abusing. They are very good at hiding their addiction and covering it up to where you wouldn't even know. So the same year that they hired him a tutor, his parents attempted to save their marriage. And they started counseling sessions together. But they continued to fight a lot of the times. And his dad eventually discovered that his mother had engaged in a very brief affair in September of 1977. So they both decided to just divorce and end the marriage. And they just ended up telling their sons that they wanted to just do it as amicably as possible. So his dad moved out the house by the beginning of 1978. So at this point, Jeffrey's living by himself with his mom and his brother. I mean, his dad left, Jeffrey's by himself with his mom and brother. And then May of the same year, 1978, he graduated high school. Barely, but he graduated high school. And a few weeks before he graduated, one of his teachers observed him sitting close to the school parking lot while he was drinking. And from the teacher's description was he had several cans of beer with him. So he had drinking beers in the school parking lot. and the teacher threatened him to report it to report Jeffrey drinking on campus. And Jeffrey pretty much just explained it off as he was experiencing a lot of problems at home, and that the school's guidance counselor knew that he was drinking and knew his problems that he was having at home. And then that spring, Joyce and his younger brother David had moved out the family home to go live with some relatives. They moved away. And so Jeffrey had just turned 18 at this point, and he got to remain in the family home by himself. And at this time, it was just kind of like Jeffrey was left in limbo in the family home by himself. He was 18. He wasn't a part of his dad and mom's custodial agreement because he was 18. And once they divorced in July of 1978, his mom was awarded custody of her younger son and alimony payments, but she never once sent money to Jeffrey to help him. Once again, he was kind of just pushed to the side, like, you're 18, figure it out on your own. So then after this, Jeffrey committed his first murder in 1978, 3 weeks after he graduated high school. And whenever he committed this murder, he was living by himself in the family home. Because like I said, his mom had moved out. His dad was already gone because he moved out prior to them divorcing. And no one came back to the family home. It was just Jeffrey. So he had all this time and the space to do whatever he wanted with no repercussions, nothing. No one knew. No one was there. So pretty much following their decision to divorce, his dad temporarily lived in a nearby motel, and his mom relocated to Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin with his younger brother. So he was just kind of left by himself to do whatever. So on June 18th of this year, Jeffrey picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. So on June 18th of 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer had picked up a hitchhiker who is pictured right here. This is Stephen Hicks. And he was almost 19 years old at the time he was abducted. Jeffrey lured him to his house with the pretext of the two young men drinking some alcohol together, and Stephen, who had been hitchhiking to a rock concert in Lockwood Corners, agreed to accompany him back to his house. And according to Jeffrey, after several hours of them drinking and listening to music, Stephen had wanted to leave, and Jeffrey didn't want him to. So in response to this, Jeffrey bludgeoned Stephen Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell. And then he even later stated that he struck Hicks in the head from behind twice. And Hicks was sat upon a chair at this point. He had no idea the attack was coming, according to Jeffrey. He had literally no idea whatsoever that he was about to be literally killed. And whenever Hicks fell unconscious, Jeffrey strangled him to death because beating him wasn't enough, apparently, with the bar of the dumbbell. So he strangled that man to death with a dumbbell bar. And then he stripped him of all of his clothing and then proceeded to masturbate as he stood above Stephen Hicks's dead body. Then the next day, Jeffrey dissected Hicks in his basement of his family home. And he even later buried Stephen in a shallow grave in his backyard before several weeks later, he would then unbury him and tearing the flesh from the bones. And then he dissolved the flesh in an acidic bath before flushing the solution down the toilet of the family home. And then he proceeded to crush Stephen's skeleton and all the bones of his body with a sledgehammer and scattered them across the woods behind his family home. So, 6 weeks after Stephen Hicks was murdered, Jeffrey's dad and his new fiance returned to their family home, where they had discovered Jeffrey living there by himself. And in August of that year, Jeffrey enrolled into the Ohio State University, hoping to major in business. He did one semester at one term at Ohio State, and he was known to be completely unproductive while he was in school. And it's believed that that was largely due to the fact that he was persistently abusing alcohol throughout the majority of that term of the year. So it was known that he was drinking all the time. And it has also been known that he received failing grades in Intro to Anthropology, Classical Civilizations, and Administrative Science. The only course he was actually successful in completing was riflery, and he received a B- in that class. His overall GPA whenever he finished the first term of the school year was a 0.45 out of a 4.0 average. So there was no way he was passing that first semester of school. And on one occasion, his dad had paid just a surprise visit to him at school and found his son's room strewn with a whole bunch of empty liquor bottles. So his dad found his room completely and utterly destroyed with liquor bottles all over the place from him drinking so much. So despite that his dad had paid for a second semester of Jeffrey going to school, Jeffrey dropped out of Ohio State after 3 months of school. And in June of the following year, 1979, on his father's encouragement, Jeffrey enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. And on July 13th in 1979, he was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic in the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. So a murderer who became known as one of the most prolific serial killers, who literally did the most damage to people and the most harm, was a person that was trained to save people's lives in the army. It's crazy to think about how the world changes and how people are not always what they seem to be, because he was fully trained to save people's lives, and he ended up murdering numerous amounts of people, which is insane to me. According to publicized reports, Jeffrey's first year in the service, he was only an average or slightly above average soldier, so he didn't make a huge impression while he was in the army either. He just was barely average, maybe slightly above average. So he didn't really do a lot to stand out in the army either. And 2 soldiers that were in the army at the same time that Jeffrey was enlisted came forward and stated that they were raped by him while they were enlisted in the army. And one of them stated in 2010 that he repeatedly was assaulted by Jeffrey Dahmer over a 17-month period while they were both stationed in Baumholder. So even people from the military who he was enlisted to help protect at this time came forward and said that he was raping them while he was in the army to protect people. Wow. So he honestly, I feel like, didn't care about getting caught or not getting caught. He just didn't care. And then another soldier came forward and thinks that Jeffrey Dahmer drugged him and raped him inside one of their armored personnel carriers in 1979. So pretty much due to Jeffrey's alcohol abuse, and I mean, he drank a lot. I mean, it's very well known that Jeffrey Dahmer was a known alcoholic and he drank a lot. So due to this, his performance in the army never went above like subpar performance. So his performance continued to deteriorate in the army, and in March of 1981 he was deemed unsuitable for military service, and he was later discharged from the army. So due to his alcohol drinking once again, at this time he received a honorable discharge, and his superiors did not believe that any problems Dahmer had inside of the army would be applicable to civilian life. So, pretty much, I mean, these people that were raped and assaulted by Jeffrey Dahmer came forward later. But, I mean, if these people are coming forward now, well, later in life, I mean, you think that somewhere along the lines, someone may have said something about him somewhere. And I'm sorry, but to state that his drinking problem would not then lead to him having problems outside of the army is crazy to me. I don't see how that would not be applicable to his civilian life. Like, that's just not something I can see not playing a factor. So then, on March 24th of 1981, shortly after Jeffrey was discharged from the army, he was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for debriefing, and then he was provided with a plane ticket to travel anywhere inside of the country, inside the US. And he would later tell the police that he could not return to his home to face his father, so he had then decided that he was going to travel to Miami, Florida, both because he was tired of the cold, and he also wanted to attempt to live by his own means. And in Florida, Jeffrey had found employment in a delicatessen and rented a room in a nearby motel. He spent most of his salary on the alcohol he was drinking, and very soon after he got there, he was evicted from the motel that he was staying in for non-payment, and he had initially spent his evenings on a beach as he continued to work at a sandwich shop until phoning his father and asking him to return to Ohio in September of the same year. So he wasn't even in Miami for a year before he had to return back home. Once he returned to Ohio, Jeffrey initially resided with his father and his stepmother, but he insisted that he needed numerous amounts of chores that they would delegate to him so he could occupy his time while he looked for work. And he continued to drink very heavily while he was living at his dad's house and his family home. And 2 weeks after he had returned to Ohio, he was arrested for drunken disorderly conduct, and he was fined $60 and given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. First time he got off the hook. His dad had tried to unsuccessfully get Jeffrey to stop drinking alcohol. And then in December of 1981, him and his stepmother sent him to live with his grandma in West Allis, Wisconsin. And Jeffrey's grandma was the only person in his family who Jeffrey displayed any type of affection towards. So him and his grandma were very close from him growing up and to his adulthood. She was the only person in his life that he would give any type of affection towards. That should be noted. And his dad and stepmom's intention of sending him there was their hope that with her influence and the change of his scenery where he was living at would persuade him to stop drinking at least so much, I'm sure, if not stop drinking altogether, to find a job and then live a responsible life. And initially it seemed like that was working. Their living together was very harmonious, and Jeffrey was known to accompany his grandma to church, and he willingly undertook chores around the house to help her. He also actively was looking for work whenever he originally started living with his grandma. And he also was known to abide by the majority of her house rules, except for, of course, drinking and smoking. He still did those. With the new influence in his life, initially, it brought results to Jeffrey, and his parents saw it. And in early 1982, Jeffrey found employment as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. And he held that job for 10 months before he was laid off. and he remained unemployed for over 2 years after this job. And during that time, it was known that he lived off of whatever money his grandma would provide him. So he was living off his grandma for 2 years. Shortly before Jeffrey lost his job, he was arrested for indecent exposure. And on August 7th of 1982, at Wisconsin State Fair, Jeffrey this is whenever the event occurred, and he had exposed himself to a crowd of 25 women and children. And for that incident, he was only convicted of a $50 fine plus court costs. So, strike 2. And he got like a, don't do it again, buddy. So then, in January of 1985, so 3 years after the incident that happened at the state fair, Jeffrey was hired as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, and he worked there from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 days a week, but he worked night shifts, so 6 nights a week. Trace that. With Saturday evenings off. And shortly after Jeffrey found employment, an incident happened at his business where he was propositioned by another man while sitting reading in the West Allis Public Library. The stranger threw a note at Jeffrey offering to perform, but I don't even know how to say the word, perform oral sex on him. And Jeffrey did not respond to the proposition. It stirred, but because even though he did not respond to it, it started to stir up fantasies of control and dominance that he had developed as a teenager. So it started to bring up old thoughts again. And he began to familiarize himself with the Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses and bookstores in his area. And he was also known around this time that he stole a male mannequin to be more specific, from a store. And he used it for sexual stimulation until his grandma discovered it and made him get rid of it out of the closet he had it hidden in. So then by 1985, very late into that year, Jeffrey had begun regularly to frequent these bathhouses he had found. And he described these places as being very relaxing. And during his sexual encounters, he became frustrated at his partners moving too much during the sexual act. He didn't like whenever people moved around. So following his arrest, he stated that he trained himself to view people as objects, and they were only to be used for pleasure instead of looking at them as people. And for that reason, beginning in June of 1986, he administered sleeping pills into his partner's drinks. So he would put these sleeping pills into the alcoholic beverages he would provide to these men and sedate them, and then proceed to rape their unconscious bodies so that he could still get off and they wouldn't move around during the sexual act, and he would get his fix. So after 12 instances of this happening, the bathhouse administration that he went to revoked his membership, so he began to use hotel rooms for his practices of this. So because the bathhouse was like, nah, buddy, you ain't doing this in our house, our bathhouses, that's not how you treat our people, he decided that he was going to go and get himself a hotel room to continue his practice. And then shortly after his membership of the bathhouses was revoked, Jeffrey had read a report in a newspaper that was regarding an upcoming funeral of an 18-year-old male. And he came up with this idea in his head of stealing the freshly interred corpse. Okay? And then taking it home. But according to Jeffrey, whenever he went to dig up the coffin from the ground, the soil was too hard, so he could not get the body out of the ground to take the body home with him. So he abandoned that plan shortly after he started attempting it. So then, in August of 1986, Jeffrey was arrested for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys as he stood by the Kinnickinnic River. I think that's how you say that. I'm sorry if I fucked that up. He initially admitted to the offense and was again charged with indecent exposure. But he then changed his story and said that he was merely urinating and that he was unaware that there was two boys across from him. So then the charge was dropped to disorderly conduct. And on March of 1987, Jeffrey was sentenced to 1 year probation with additional instructions he had to undergo counseling. So, Jeffrey Dahmer was then again given a third chance. 3 strikes, you should have been out, buddy. But he wasn't. He was still free to continue doing all these crazy fantasies that he had planned in his mind. He was able to get away with whatever he wanted at this point, and I would assume that he thought that he could just get away with murder, pretty much, because literally at this point he's had 3 chances to be reprimanded and something happened to him and nothing was done. So he was probably like, they're not gonna do nothing to me. I can just continue doing what I'm doing. Let's make it more interesting. So at this point, we are now in November of 1987. Okay? So on November 20th of 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer, who at the time was residing with his grandmother still in West Allis, encountered a 28-year-old male from Ontonagon, Michigan, and his name was Stephen Tuomi at a bar, and he persuaded him to return to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where Jeffrey had previously rented a room for the evening. And according to Jeffrey, he had no intention of murdering Stephen Tuomi, but rather intended to drug him and rape him as he lay unconscious underneath him. So he's like, nah, I didn't plan on killing this dude. I just wanted to drug him and rape him. That's it. I didn't mean to kill him at this point, right? Didn't mean for him to die, buddy. I just wanted to drug him and rape him. The following morning, though, Jeffrey awoke from his sleep to find Stephen lying beneath him on the bed, and Jeffrey described his chest as crushed in and bruised black and blue. And apparently Jeffrey described his body as being riddled with bruises all over. Blood was also seeping from the corner of Stephen's mouth at this point, and Jeffrey's fist and one of his forearms were extensively bruised, which I would assume from the attack and Stephen probably trying to defend himself would be my assumption, is that Stephen was trying to defend himself from Jeffrey and Jeffrey was fighting back to keep him at bay and under control. So then Jeffrey had then stated that he had no memory of killing Stephen Tuomi, and he later informed investigators that he could not believe that had happened. But once again, he's like, dude, I don't remember what happened. I did not mean to kill that man. I just wanted to drug him and rape him. And then to dispose of Stephen Tuomi's body, Jeffrey purchased a very large suitcase in which he transported the body to his grandmother's house. And he kept his body in his grandmother's basement for a week. And then he severed the head from the body, the arms, the legs, all from the torso area of his body. He then filleted the bones from the body before cutting the flesh into pieces small enough to handle. And then Jeffrey proceeded to place the flesh inside of plastic garbage bags. Then he wrapped the bones inside of a sheet and pounded them into splinters with a sledgehammer. And the entire process of dismembering Stephen's body took Jeffrey approximately 2 hours in his grandmother's basement to complete. He disposed of all of Stephen's remains, excluding his head, into the trash. For a total of 2 weeks after he murdered Stephen, Jeffrey retained his head wrapped in a blanket. And then after those 2 weeks, Jeffrey decided to boil the head in a mixture of Soilex, which is an alkali-based industrial detergent, and bleach, in an effort to retain the skull as best as he could. He was unable to keep it because the mixture he made was not correctly made. So the bones became too brittle from the bleaching process. So he was unable to use the skull for its intended purpose of his stimulus for masturbation. So then he proceeded to pulverize the bones and dispose of the skull. And then following the murder of Stephen, Jeffrey began to actively seek victims. So after his second murder that he claims he had no recollection of doing, he then began to actively seek people to kill. And most of the people that he had encountered at the time he was seeking victims were in or close to gay bars, and he would typically lure them back to his grandma's house. So he had an MO. He would meet these men at the gay bar, and he would lead them back to his grandmother's house after. And then after he'd get them back to his grandmother's house, he would proceed to drug them before or shortly after he engaged in sexual activity with him. Once he then rendered the victim unconscious with the sleeping pills he was using to lace their drinks, he then killed them by strangulation. After that, 2 months after the murder of Stephen Tuomi, Jeffrey found another victim. And this was a 14-year-old Native American male prostitute, and his name was James Dockstader. I think that's how you say his last name. He was 14 years old, and Jeffrey proceeded to lure him to his home with the offer of $50 to pose for some new photos. And then once they got back to Jeffrey's grandmother's house in West Allis, the pair engaged in sexual relations before Jeffrey drugged him and then strangled him on the floor of the basement, the cellar, which is the basement. And then Jeffrey left his body in the cellar for a whole week before he dismembered it, and which was in the same manner that he had Stephen the previous 2 months before. And then he proceeded to place all of James's body parts, except his head, the skull, into the trash. He boiled the skull and initially retained the skull before he pulverized it. After this, Jeffrey found another victim that he proceeded to do unspeakable things to. Oh man, Jeffrey Dahmer was able to get away with a lot of stuff that this just frustrates me, because it's like, at this point, he's gotten away with so many things that I just feel like he should not have been able to get away with. Oh, it's very frustrating. So then, on March 24th of 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer met his next victim, 22-year-old Richard Guerrero. He was a bisexual male, and Jeffrey met him outside of a gay bar called The Phoenix. Jeffrey lured him back to his grandmother's residence, and he offered him $50 with the intention of only spending the remainder of the night with him. Then he proceeded to drug Guerrero with sleeping pills, and he strangled him with a leather strap. Then Jeffrey performed oral sex upon Guerrero's dead body. Then his body was dismembered within 24 hours of him being murdered, with the remains being again disposed in the trash and the skull again retained before Jeffrey would then pulverize it several months later. And then on April 23rd, Jeffrey met another one of his victims. He lured another young man back to his grandmother's house yet again, and gave him a laced cup of coffee with sleeping pills. But luckily for this victim, his grandmother heard him downstairs and called, "Is that you, Jeff?" to Jeffrey downstairs. And even though Jeffrey replied as in it was only him downstairs by himself, his grandmother luckily noticed that he was not alone, in which turn saved the young man that he had abducted's life. So because his grandma caught him with another person, he opted to not kill that victim, and instead he waited until he became unconscious before he took him to the hospital. So he took him to County General Hospital in order to get rid of him because he couldn't kill him, knowing that his grandmother knew that he had someone there with him. So then, in September of 1988, Jeffrey's grandma asked him to move out because of his habit of bringing young men to her house late at night and the foul smells that were coming from the basement and also the garage, which is where he was throwing the dead bodies. Jeffrey found a one-bedroom apartment on North 25th Street, and he moved into his new residence on September 25th of 1988. The following day after he was moved in to his apartment, he was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy whom he lured to his home with the pretext of posing nude for photographs. And then in 1989, January of that year, he was convicted of second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes. And then his sentence in May of 1989 was suspended. So now he's at 4 times of not having anything happen to him for any of the wrongdoings he has committed. 4 times. This man was allowed to literally get away with so many things that no man should have been able to get away with. He was arrested, convicted, and then had his sentence suspended. And then on March of 20th of that same year, Jeffrey commenced a 10-day Easter absence from work, during which he moved back into his grandmother's house. So 2 months after he was convicted, and 2 months prior to his sentencing for the sexual assault, Jeffrey murdered his 5th victim. He murdered his 5th victim while he was waiting for his sentencing to happen for literally assaulting somebody. Like, how are you able to keep getting away with this? I have no idea, but someone should really do something about it, because this is not okay, and none of these men deserve this at all whatsoever. I'm sorry. So then, 2 months while he was waiting to be sentenced for his conviction, he met mixed race 24-year-old aspiring model Anthony Sears, who he met at a gay bar on March 25th of 1989. And according to Jeffrey, on this particular occasion, he was not looking to commit a crime. However, shortly before the bar was scheduled to close, Sears started talking to Dahmer, which then in turn led him to deciding to murder this man, just because he talked to him right before the bar closed. So then, after that, Jeffrey then lured Sears back to his grandmother's house, where the pair engaged in oral sex before Jeffrey then drugged and killed Sears. All because he talked to him right before the bar closed. What? What do you mean? So then the following morning, after Jeffrey killed Sears, he placed the corpse inside of his grandmother's bathtub, where he then decapitated the body before attempting to flay the corpse. He then stripped the flesh from the bones and then pulverized the bones, which again were disposed in the trash at his grandma's house. And according to Jeffrey, he found Sears exceptionally attractive. And Sears was the first victim whom he would permanently retain any body parts. And he preserved Sears' severed head and his genitalia in acetone. And then he stored them in his work locker at work, where he was I'm not sure what he was doing. I think he was still a phlebotomist at this point, but don't quote me on that. And then whenever he moved to his new address the following year, he then moved the remains from his work locker to his new apartment. So then, on May 23rd of 1989, Jeffrey was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 1 year in the House of Correction prison, with work release permitted in order to be able to keep his job, and he was also required to register as a sex offender. But 2 months before his scheduled release from the work camp, Jeffrey was paroled from the regiment. His 5-year probation imposed in 1989 began once he was released from the work camp. And upon release, Jeffrey temporarily moved back into his grandma's house in West Allis before he moved again in May of 1990 into the Oxford Apartments, and they were located on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. And although they were located in a high crime area, the apartment was very close to where Jeffrey worked, and it was furnished, and it only cost him $300 a month and included all bills, excluding electricity. So it was very economical for him to be able to afford that apartment working. On May 14th of 1990, Jeffrey moved out of his grandma's house and into 924 North 25th Street in apartment 213, and this is where he would reside and commit the remainder of his murders until he was arrested and caught. So whenever he moved into this apartment, he took Sears' severed head and genitals with him. Within 1 week of his moving into the new apartment, Jeffrey had killed his 6th victim. Within 1 week of moving into this apartment, he killed his next victim. So he did not even wait enough time to get comfy in anything. Like, he did not waste any time whatsoever to get comfy and kill his next victim. So think about that. Like, he did not waste any time whatsoever for murdering this man. So within a week of moving into his new apartment, Jeffrey killed his 6th victim, Raymond Smith. He was a 32-year-old male prostitute at the time of his murder, and Jeffrey lured him into his apartment with the promise of $50 for sex. And inside the apartment, he gave Raymond a drink that was laced with 7 sleeping pills, and then he proceeded to manually strangle him. And then the day after he murdered him, he purchased a Polaroid camera with which he would then take several pictures of Raymond's dead body in suggestive positions before he dismembered him in the bathroom of his apartment. He boiled the legs and the arms of the body and the pelvis in a still kettle with Solex, which allowed him to then rinse the bones in the sink of his apartment. Then he proceeded to dissolve the remainder of Smith's skeleton, excluding the skull, of course, in a container filled with acid that he kept in his apartment. He later then proceeded to spray paint Raymond's skull, which he placed alongside the skull of Sears's head that was laid upon a black towel inside of a metal filing cabinet inside of his apartment. Approximately 1 week after he murdered Raymond Smith, it was I was around or on May 27th of that same year. Jeffrey had tried to lure another young man into his apartment, but on this occasion, the person got lucky, in my opinion. And Jeffrey accidentally drank the drink that was intended for his victim, which was laced with sleeping pills. He woke up the next day and discovered that his victim had stolen several items of his clothing, $300 from him, and his watch. And Jeffrey never reported the incident to the police, although on May 29th of that year, he divulged to his probation officer that he had been robbed. So he didn't call the police because he didn't want to get investigated by the police and have them discover what was in his house. But he just let his probation officer know. That way he was aware of it. But the police were never called. So then in June of 1990, Jeffrey lured another man to his apartment. So this is Eddie Smith. He is a 27-year-old acquaintance of Jeffrey who was lured into Jeffrey's apartment. He was then drugged and strangled by Jeffrey. And on this occasion, rather than immediately acidifying and getting rid of the body, or repeating any of his previous processes of bleaching, which had rendered previous victims' skulls to be very brittle and not keepable, Jeffrey placed Smith's skeleton in the freezer for several months in the hope that he would retain moisture. After he froze the skeleton, he realized that it did not retain moisture, and the skeleton of the victim would be acidified several months later. And then he accidentally destroyed the skull whenever he placed it in the oven to dry, a process that caused the skull to explode inside of his oven. And then Jeffrey himself was later to inform police that he had felt rotten about Smith's murder, as he had been unable to retain any part of him after he was killed. So then, less than 3 months after Jeffrey was killed Edward Smith, he then found another victim that he then proceeded to lure back to his house. And this was 22-year-old Ernest Miller, and he encountered him on the corner of North 27th Street. Miller agreed to accompany Dahmer to his apartment for $50 and further agreed to allow him to listen to his heart and his stomach. And then when Jeffrey attempted to perform oral sex upon Ernest, he was informed that'll cost you extra, whereupon Jeffrey gave Ernest a laced drink with 2 sleeping pills in it. And on this occasion, Jeffrey only had 2 sleeping pills left to give to the victim. Therefore, Ernest did not go unconscious like his previous victims, so Jeffrey was left to kill him by slashing his carotid artery with the same knife he used to dissect all of his previous victims' bodies. Miller then bled to death within minutes of Jeffrey attacking him, and then Jeffrey posed the body nude for various suggestive Polaroid pictures by placing the body in his bathtub and then placing the body in his bathtub for dismemberment. Jeffrey repeatedly kissed and talked to many of the severed heads while he dismembered the remainders of the bodies. Jeffrey then wrapped Ernest's heart, biceps, and portions of flesh from his legs inside of plastic bags and placed them inside of his fridge, which he would later use for consumption. So he would eat the victim. He then boiled the remaining flesh and organs into a jelly-like substance using Solex, which again enabled him to rinse the flesh off of the skeleton he had, which he intended to retain. And then to preserve the skeleton, Jeffrey placed the bones in a light bleach solution for 24 hours before allowing them to dry on a cloth for 1 week inside of his apartment. And then the severed head was initially placed inside the refrigerator before being stripped of the flesh and then painted and then coated with enamel. Oh my God. 3 weeks after Jeffrey Dahmer murdered Ernest, he then found another victim. So then he found this victim, who I think it's insane that he was still able to get away with killing these people for so long. 22-year-old David Thomas on September 24th of the same year. And he met him at the Grand Avenue Mall and then persuaded him to return home with Jeffrey for a few drinks with additional money on an offer if he would pose for photographs for Jeffrey to have. So then, in his statement to the police after he was arrested, Jeffrey stated that after giving Thomas a drink laced with sedatives, he did not feel attracted to him, but he was afraid to allow him to awake in case he would be angry over having been drugged. Therefore, he strangled him, dismembered the body, and intentionally retaining no body parts whatsoever. He also photographed the dismemberment process and then retained these photographs, which later aided the police officers in the identification of Thomas's body. Following the murder of Thomas, Jeffrey then did not kill anyone for almost 5 months after this murder. Although on a minimum of 5 occasions between October of 1990 and February of 1991, he unsuccessfully attempted to lure men to his apartment. So he was not able to kill anybody, but it wasn't because he chose not to try and kill somebody. It was because he was unable to successfully get people to come back to his apartment. He also was known to have regularly complained of feelings of both anxiety and depression with his probation officer throughout the year of 1990, with frequent references to his sexuality, his solitary lifestyle, and financial difficulties. On several occasions, Jeffrey was also known to have referred to harboring suicidal thoughts. Then on February of 1991, Jeffrey met another one of his victims, and this would be 17-year-old Curtis Schroeder, who was standing at a bus stop near Marquette University, which is where his father went to school, if you don't remember. And according to Jeffrey, he lured Schroeder into his apartment with an offer of money for posing for nude pictures, with an added incentive of sexual intercourse. Jeffrey then drugged and strangled Curtis with a leather strap and then dismembered him, with Jeffrey retaining his skull, hands, and genitals and photographing each stage of the whole process of him dismembering his body. And then after that murder, less than 2 months after he murdered Curtis, he then proceeded to murder another victim, which is 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, who was walking to get a key cut at the time of his encounter on April 7th of 1991, where he met Jeffrey Dahmer. Errol was heterosexual, and Jeffrey lured him to his apartment, where he then drugged him, drilled a hole into his skull, and then poured hydrochloric acid into the hole inside of his head. And according to Jeffrey, Lindsay awoke after this experiment, which Jeffrey had conceived in the hope of inducing a permanent, unresistant, and submissive state, saying, "I have a headache. What time is it?" In response to this, Jeffrey again drugged Lindsay, then strangled him. He decapitated Lindsay and retained the skull, He then flayed Lindsay's body, placing the skin in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks in a hope of permanently retaining it. Reluctantly, he disposed of Lindsay's skin when he noted it had become too frayed and brittle from the solution he used. And then by 1991, fellow residents of the apartment complex he lived in repeatedly complained to the building's owner. My bad, manager, not owner. Sopa Princewill, of the foul smells emanating from apartment 213. But this time he had people in his fellow residents of the apartment he was living in saying, hey, there's something not right. There's a really bad smell coming from this apartment specifically. So like, I mean, people are noticing these not so great smells coming from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, and they're like, hey, something's not right. We need you to investigate this. Like, we need you to figure out what this man is doing and why does his apartment stink so badly. At this point, the manager of the apartment then reaches out to Dahmer to be like, hey, you know, people around the building are wondering what the smell is coming from, and also they're hearing sounds of falling objects and the occasional sound of a chainsaw. But the manager of the apartment didn't go to his house and be like, hey, you know, what's going on? We need to investigate this and figure out what you're doing inside the apartment. They just called. And so then, they did, you know, the manager contacted Jeffrey, and literally pretty much every single time that they reached out to him, he had an excuse for why those noises were going on or why it smelled. So the first time they initially contacted him, he kind of like brushed it off like, oh, you know, his apartment freezer broke, and so all the food went bad, so he had to like literally clean out his whole apartment. Oh, the smell's gonna be gone soon, like, and the landlord's just like, okay buddy, get it together, clean it up, get it gone. And then after that, he had another excuse. The next time they reached out to him, like, hey dude, the smell's not gone, you know, what's going on? He had another reason, just nonchalantly like, oh, you know, the odor came back because several of my tropical fish died. And then he just was like, oh, but don't worry, I got it, I'll take care of the smell, it's fine, it's gonna go away, I promise. And then after that happened, on the afternoon of May 26th of 1991, Jeffrey encountered a 14-year-old young man, and his name, I'm gonna probably butcher it, is Conorak Sintha Samphone. I don't know how to say his last name. I'm just gonna call him Conorak. On Wisconsin Avenue. By coincidence, Conorak was the younger brother of a boy who Jeffrey had molested in 1988. He approached the young boy with an offer of money to accompany him to his apartment to pose for some Polaroid photos at this point. And according to Jeffrey, Conorak was initially reluctant to the proposal, but before changing his mind and accompanying him back to his apartment, where the youth then posed for 2 pictures in his underwear before Jeffrey drugged him into unconsciousness and then performed oral sex on him. On this occasion, Jeffrey drilled a single hole into Conorak's head, through which he injected hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe of his brain. Before Conorak fell unconscious, Jeffrey led the boy into his bedroom, where the body of a 31-year-old Tony Hughes, who Jeffrey had killed 3 days earlier, laid naked on the floor. And according to Jeffrey, he believed that Conorak saw the body, yet did not react to seeing the bloated corpse, likely because of the effects of the sleeping pills that he had already just ingested, and also the hydrochloric acid that was inside of his frontal lobe at this point. So then Conorak soon became unconscious, whereupon Jeffrey drank several beers while lying alongside Konarak before leaving his apartment to go get more beer at a bar nearby, and then purchase some alcohol back on his way home. So then on the early morning hours of May 27th, the day after, the morning of after like he abducted Konarak, Jeffrey returned towards his apartment to discover that Konarak was sitting outside naked on the corner of 25th and State, talking in Lao, with 3 distressed young women standing near him. So Jeffrey then approached the 3 women and explained to the women that Konarak, whom he referred to by an alias of John, I cannot say this last name, I'm not going to attempt to say it, we're just going to call him John, was his friend, and attempted to lead him back to his apartment by the arm. The 3 women dissuaded Jeffrey and then explained that they had called 911. And upon the arrival of 2 cops from Milwaukee, John Balzarak and Joseph Gabrish, Jeffrey's demeanor relaxed. He informed the officers that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend that had drunk too much the following night because of a fight, and that he frequently behaved this way when he was intoxicated. The 3 women were understandably frustrated with the situation, and when one of the trio attempted, to try and let the cops know that, hey, that this dude is bleeding from his butt, like he's bleeding out of his butt, and that he seemed to be struggling against Jeffrey's attempts to walk him to the apartment, the cops were very rude and informed her to butt out and shut the hell up and not to interfere, adding the incident was domestic. So pretty much being like, you need to mind your own business, lady. Obviously, can't you tell that they're together and they have stuff going on? They're fighting. It's fine. And then against the protests of these 3 women, the officers simply covered Konarak in a towel and walked him back to Jeffrey's apartment, where, in an effort to verify his claim that Konarak was his lover, Jeffrey then proceeded to show the officers the 2 semi-nude photos that he had taken of him the previous night, that he paid him for. And then the officers later reported having noted a strange scent reminiscent of excrement inside the apartment. This odor emanated from the decomposing body of Hughes, who was dead in the bedroom. Jeffrey then stated that to investigate this, one officer simply peeked his head through the bedroom, but really didn't take a good look. So then the officers left, departing the remark to Dahmer that he needed to take good care of Konarak, who they were referring to as John. So then, if the 2 cops who went to the house had actually conducted a background check on Jeffrey, they would have found out that he was convicted of being a child molester under probation, and they would have investigated further. Also, upon the departure of those 2 officers leaving his apartment, Jeffrey again injected hydrochloric acid into Konarak's head. And on the second occasion, the injection proved to kill him. Following the next day, May 28th, Jeffrey took a day's leave from work to devote himself to the dismemberment of the bodies of Konarak and Hughes. He retained both of their skulls. So literally, if the cops would have dug a little further, Jeffrey's murder spree would have ended there. Konarak would have still been alive. They would have ended everything right then and there if they would have just investigated him a little bit more and actually looked in the house instead of peeking their head into the bedroom. So then on June 30th, Jeffrey traveled to Chicago, where he then met his next victim, 20-year-old Matt Turner. He was at a bus station whenever Jeffrey encountered him, and Matt accepted a offer from Jeffrey to travel to Milwaukee with him, for a professional photo shoot at his apartment. And whenever they reached his apartment, Jeffrey then proceeded to strangle, dismember his body, and placed his head and internal organs in separate plastic bags inside of his freezer. Turner was not reported missing. 5 days later, on July 5th, Jeffrey found another victim, Jeremiah Weinberger, I think that's how you say his last name, from a Chicago bar to his apartment on the promise of spending the weekend with him. He later drugged Jeremiah and twice injected boiling water through his skull, sending him into a coma from which he died 2 days later. And then, following this murder, only a mere 10 days after he murdered poor Jeremiah, he then moved on to his next victim, which would be his second to last victim that he would murder before he was caught. 24-year-old Oliver Lacey. Oliver was abducted from the corner of 27th and Kilbourne, which is where he encountered Jeffrey. He agreed to go accompany Jeffrey underneath the ruse that he would be posing for nude photos and accompanied him back to his apartment, where the pair engaged in tentative sexual activities together before Jeffrey proceeded to drug Lacey. And on this specific occasion, Jeffrey intended to prolong the time he spent with Oliver while he was alive. After unsuccessfully attempting to render Oliver unconscious with chloroform, he then phoned into his workplace to request a day off. The next day after he requested off, he was then later suspended from work. Then after he strangled Lacey and killed him, Jeffrey then had sex with his dead body before he dismembered him. And he placed Lacey's head and heart in the refrigerator with his skeleton along also in his freezer. Then 4 days later, Jeffrey received the word that he had been fired from his job. So 4 days after he committed this murder of Lacey, he found out that he was then fired from his current employer. And then this sent him into like a very angry time. And upon him receiving this news, he then lured 25-year-old Joseph Bradhoft to his apartment. Bradhoft was strangled and left lying on his bed, covered with a sheet for 2 days. And then finally, on July 21st, Jeffrey removed these sheets to find the head covered in maggots, whereupon he decapitated the body, cleaned the head, and placed it in the refrigerator. He then later acidified Bradhoft's torso along with those of the 2 other victims within the previous month that he had kept their bodies in the freezer. And then the day after this murder, on July 22nd of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was approached by 3 men with an offer of $100 to accompany him to his apartment to pose for new photos, drink beer, and simply keep him company. And then one of these 3 men, a 32-year-old named Tracy Edwards, he agreed, out of the 3 men that Jeffrey Dahmer approached, he agreed to accompany him back to his apartment. And upon entering Jeffrey's apartment, Edward noted that there was a foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor of his apartment, which Dahmer claimed to be used that he used for cleaning bricks. And after a little bit of conversation, Tracy responded to Dahmer's request to turn his head and view his tropical fish collection, whereupon Jeffrey placed a handcuff upon his wrist. When Tracy asked him what was going on, Jeffrey unsuccessfully attempted to cuff his wrists together. Then he told Tracy to accompany him to the bedroom to pose for these nude photos. While inside the bedroom, Tracy noted that there was a nude male posters on the wall that a video of The Exorcist 3 was playing on Jeffrey's TV. And he also noted that there was a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner of the room from which the strong odor was projecting from. And then Jeffrey took out a knife and informed Edwards that he intended to take nude pictures of him. In an attempt to appease Jeffrey at this point, Tracy unbuttoned his shirt, saying he would allow him to do so if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. So then Jeffrey, in response to this promise, turned his attention towards the TV. And at this point, Tracy observed Jeffrey rocking back and forth and chanting before turning his attention back onto Edwards. And he placed his head on Tracy's chest, listening to his heartbeat, and then with the knife pressed it against his intended victim, which was Tracy at this point, and informed him that he intended to eat his heart. And at this point, Tracy's trying to stay alive. So in an effort to keep Jeffrey from attacking him, Edwards repeated at this point that Jeffrey was his friend and that he wasn't going anywhere. He was going to stay with him. And then Tracy decided that he was going to either jump from a window or run through the unlocked front door at the next available time that he could get away. When Edwards stated that he needed to use the bathroom, he asked if he could sit with a beer in the living room where there was air conditioning. Jeffrey consented, and the pair walked into the living room when Edwards exited the bathroom. And inside the living room, Jeffrey and Edward were sitting around, and Tracy pretty much waited for an opportunity where Jeffrey had a momentary lapse of concentration before requesting to use the bathroom once again. This time, whenever Tracy rose from the couch, he noted that Jeffrey was not holding the handcuffs. And he took this opportunity and punched Jeffrey in the face, knocking him off of balance with enough time to run out the front door that was unlocked. Then at 11:30 p.m. on this night, July 22nd, Tracy flagged down two Milwaukee police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, at the corner of 25th Street, and the officers noted that Tracy had handcuffs attached to his wrist, whereupon he had told the officers at this point that some freak, as he said, had placed these handcuffs upon him and asked the police if they could try and remove them. When the officers tried their handcuff keys, it failed to fit the brand of handcuffs that he had on him. So Edwards agreed that he would accompany the officers back to the apartment that he had previously escaped from. And told them that he had previously been stuck in that apartment for 5 hours on that evening. So the officers and Edwards arrived back at apartment 213, and Jeffrey invited the trio inside and acknowledged that he indeed placed the handcuffs on Edwards, although he offered no explanation as to why he did it. He just told them, yeah, I did that. I locked him on handcuffs. And at this point, Edwards divulged to the officers that Jeffrey also had brandished a large knife upon him and that this happened in the bedroom. So Jeffrey then made no comment to this revelation, and he indicated to one of the officers, Mueller to be specific, that his key for the handcuffs was in the bedside table of his room. And as the officer then entered Jeffrey's bedroom, Jeffrey attempted to pass him himself to retrieve the key. And the second officer then informed him to back off. While they were in the bedroom, Mueller noted that there was indeed a very large knife beneath the bed. He also saw an open drawer, which upon closer inspection, he saw the Polaroid pictures, which many were of the human bodies in various stages of decomposition and dismemberment. And then Mueller also noted that the decor they had been taken in the very apartment which they were standing in. Then Mueller walked in the living room to show to his partner, uttering the words, "These are for real?" Then whenever Jeffrey had seen that Mueller was holding several of those Polaroids, he fought with the officers in order to try and resist his later arrest. The officers quickly overpowered him and then cuffed him with his hands behind his back and called for a second squad car for backup. And at this point, Mueller opened the refrigerator to reveal the freshly severed heads of a black male on the bottom shelf. And as Dahmer laid pinned on the floor beneath Ralph, he turned his head towards the officers and muttered the words, "For what I did, I should be dead." And then after a more detailed search was performed on the apartment conducted by the Milwaukee Police's Criminal Investigation Bureau, or CIB, revealed a total of 4 severed heads in Jeffrey's kitchen, a total of 7 skulls, some were painted, some were bleached, and they were found in Jeffrey's bedroom and inside the closet of his house. And then in addition, the investigators also discovered blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of the arm muscle, each wrapped in plastic bags upon the shelves. In Jeffrey's freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs, and a flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Also, in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, and a mummified scalp. And in the 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos were later discovered, dissolving in the acidic solution that Jeffrey had in that drum. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberments of Jeffrey's victims were also found. And then in the reference to the recovery of the body parts and artifacts at 924 North 25th Street, the chief medical examiner had also stated it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. So then, beginning in the early hours of the following day, July 23rd of 1991, Jeffrey was questioned by Detective Patrick Kennedy as to the murders he committed and the evidence found in his apartment. And over the following 2 weeks, Kennedy and later Detective Patrick Murphy conducted numerous interviews with Jeffrey, and which, when combined, totaled of over 60 hours worth of interview time, which is a lot of interview time if you think about it. Think about that, 60 hours of interview time. Especially if it was recorded, that's a lot of time to go through. And then Jeffrey had also waived his rights to have a lawyer present throughout his interrogations, adding that he wished to confess all he had done, as he had created this horror, and it only makes sense that he does everything he could to put into it. He readily admitted to having murdered 16 young men in Wisconsin since 1987, with one further victim, Stephen Hicks, killed in Ohio and back in 1978. Most of Jeffrey's victims had been rendered unconscious prior to their murder, although some had died as a result of having acid or boiling water injected into their brains. And as to the fact that he had no memory of the murder of Stephen Tuomi, he was unsure whether he was unconscious when beaten to death, although he did concede that it was possible that his viewing of the exposed chest of Tuomi while in a drunken stupor may have led him to unsuccessfully attempt to tear Tuomi's heart from his chest. Almost all of his murders were committed after moving into the Oxford apartments and had involved a ritual posing of the victims' bodies in suggestive positions, typically with the chest thrust outward, prior to them being dismembered. Jeffrey readily admitted to engaging in necrophilia with several of his victims' bodies, including performing sexual acts with their viscera, as he dismembered their bodies in his bathtub, he having noted that much of the blood pooled inside of his victim's chest after death. Jeffrey first removed their internal organs, and then he was known to suspend the torsos so that the blood drained into his bathtub. Before he diced up their organs that he did not want, and then removing the flesh from the body. The bones he wished to dispose of were then pulverized or acidified with a Solex and bleach solution he used to aid him in preservation of the skeletons and skulls he wished to keep. Also, Jeffrey had confessed to having consumed the hearts, livers, biceps, and portions of thighs of several of his victims that he had killed within the previous year. And whenever he was known to be describing his rate increase of killings within the 2 months prior to his arrest, Jeffrey stated that he had been completely swept away with his compulsion to kill, and even added that it was an incessant, never-ending desire to be with someone regardless of whatever the cost was. It was someone good-looking, really nice-looking, and it just filled his thoughts all day long. When he was asked as to why he had preserved a total of 7 skulls and an entire skeleton of 2 of his victims, he stated that he had been in the process of constructing a private altar of his victims' skulls, which he had intended to display on a black table located in his living room, and upon which he had photographed the bodies of many of his victims. This display of skulls was to be adorned at each side with the completed skeletons of Miller and Lacey. The 4 severed heads found inside of his kitchen fridge were to be removed of all the flesh and used in this altar, as was the skull of at least one more of his victims that was going to be planned for the future. There was incense sticks that were going to be placed at each end of the black table, above which Jeffrey was intended to place large blue lamps with extending blue globe lights. The entire construction was to be placed before a window inside of his apartment, the black shower curtain in front of it, which Jeffrey intended to sit a black leather chair. When he was asked in a November 18th interview of that same year who the altar was dedicated to, Jeffrey replied, "Myself. It was a place where I could feel at home." He had also further went on to describe that he intended to use the altar as a place for meditation, from which he believed that he would be able to draw a sense of power from. And he was later stated, if his arrest had happened 6 months later, that's what they would have found. Not the severed heads and the skulls, they would have found his altar to himself. So then 2 days later after his arrest, on July 25th, Jeffrey Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. And by August 22nd of that same year, he had been charged with a further 11 counts of murder committed within Wisconsin. And then on September 14th, investigators in Ohio, having uncovered hundreds of bone fragments in the woodland behind the address to which Jeffrey had confessed to killing his first victim, formally identified 2 molars and a vertebrae with x-ray records of Hicks. 3 days after that, Jeffrey was charged by authorities in Ohio for Hicks' murder. Jeffrey was not charged with the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards, however, nor with the murder of Stephen Tuomi. He was not charged with Tuomi's murder because the Milwaukee County District Attorney only brought the charges where murders could have been proven without a reasonable doubt. And Dahmer had no memory of actually committing this particular murder, for which no physical evidence of the crime existed. They had no proof, so they didn't have anything to go off of for them to be able to charge Jeffrey with that murder. So at his scheduled preliminary hearing on January 13th of 1992, Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Jeffrey's trial then began on January 30th of the same year. He was tried in Milwaukee for the 15 counts of first-degree murder before Judge Lawrence Graham. And by pleading guilty on January 13th to the charge brought against him, Jeffrey had waived his rights to initial trial to establish guilt, which is defined by Wisconsin law. This issue, debated by opposing counsels at Dahmer's trial, was to determine whether he suffered from either a mental or personality disorder. The prosecution claiming that any disorder did not deprive Jeffrey the ability to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to deprive him the ability to resist his impulses. The defense argued, however, that Jeffrey suffered from a mental disease and was driven by obsessions and impulses by which he was unable to control. Experts argued that Jeffrey was insane due to his necrophilic drive, his compulsion to have sexual encounters with these dead bodies. But defense expert Dr. Fred Berlin testified that Jeffrey was unable to conform his conduct at the time he had committed these crimes because he was suffering from paraphilia, or more specifically, necrophilia. Dr. Judith Becker, a professional psychiatry and psychology, was the second expert witness for the defense, and she diagnosed Jeffrey with necrophilia. The final defense expert to testify, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Carl Wallstorm, diagnosed Jeffrey with necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, and a psychotic disorder. The prosecution, however, rejected the defense's argument that Jeffrey was insane. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Resnick testified that Jeffrey did not suffer from primary necrophilia because he preferred live sexual partners, as evidenced by his efforts to create unrestrained, submissive sexual partners devoid of rational thought and to whose needs he did not have to cater. Another prosecution expert to testify was Dr. Fred Fosdale. He testified to his belief that Jeffrey was without a mental disease or defect at the time that he committed all the murders. He described Jeffrey as a calculating and cunning individual, able to differentiate between right and wrong. He also said that he had the ability to control his actions. Although Fosdale did state his belief that Jeffrey suffered from paraphilia, his conclusion was that Jeffrey was not a sadist. And the final witness to appear for the prosecution was forensic psychiatrist Patrick Dietz. He began his testimony on February 12th of 1992. Dietz testified that he did not believe that Jeffrey was suffering from any mental disease or defect at the time that he committed the crimes he did. He stated that Jeffrey went to great lengths to be alone with his victims and to have no witnesses. He explained that there was ample evidence that Jeffrey prepared in advance for each murder, and he had calculated and planned out how to commit these crimes. So therefore, his crimes were not impulsive like the defense was trying to say. And although Dietz did concede any acquisition of paraphilia was not a matter of personal choice, he also stated his belief that Jeffrey's habits of becoming intoxicated prior to committing each of the murders was significant. He stated that if he had a compulsion to kill, he would not have had to drink alcohol. He had to drink alcohol to overcome his inhibition, do the crime on which he would rather not do. Dietz had also stated Jeffrey strongly identified with evil and corrupt characters from both The Exorcist III and The Return of the Jedi, particularly the level of power held by these characters. He was expounding the significance of these movies on Jeffrey's psyche and many of the murders committed at the Oxford apartments. Patrick Dietz also explained that Jeffrey occasionally viewed scenes from these films before searching for one of his victims. Dietz diagnosed Jeffrey with substance abuse disorder, paraphilia, schizotypal personality disorder. That's it. Two court-appointed mental health professionals also testified independently of either prosecution or defense. They were forensic psychiatrist George Palermo and clinical psychologist Samuel Friedman. Palermo stated that the murders were a result of a pent-up aggression with himself. He killed those men because he wanted to kill the source of his homosexual attraction to them. In killing them, he killed what he hated in himself. He concluded that Jeffrey was a sexual sadist with antisocial personality disorder, but was legally sane at the time of these murders. Friedman testified that it was a longing for companionship that caused Jeffrey to kill. He stated that Jeffrey was not psychotic. He spoke kindly of Dahmer, describing him as amiable, pleasant to be with, courteous, and had a sense of humor. Conventionally handsome and charming in some manners. He was, and still is, a very bright young man. He diagnosed Jeffrey with personality disorder not otherwise specified, featuring borderline, obsessive-compulsive, and sadistic traits. Jeffrey's trial lasted roughly 2 weeks, and on February 14th, both counsels delivered their closing arguments to the jury, and each counsel was allowed to speak for 2 hours. Jeffrey's attorney, Gerald Boyle, argued first, repeatedly harking on the testimony of the mental health professionals, almost all of which had agreed that Jeffrey was suffering from a mental disease. Boyle argued that Jeffrey's compulsive killings had been the result of a sickness he discovered, not a choice. Boyle also said that Jeffrey was desperately lonely and profoundly sick individual, so out of control he could not conform his conduct anymore. Following the defense's 75-minute closing argument, Michael McCann delivered his closing argument for the prosecution. He described Jeffrey as a completely sane individual, in full control of all of his actions on the time of these murders being committed, who simply strove to avoid detection, which I personally kind of agree with, because if you look back, he went above and beyond to make sure that he stayed below the radar on all of these killings. So I can understand where the prosecution came from with this case. McCann also argued that the act of the murder was committed in hostility, anger, resentment, frustration, or even hatred, and that 15 of those victims that were murdered, died merely to afford Jeffrey a period of sexual pleasure. And McCann also went on to argue that by pleading guilty but insane to the charges, Jeffrey was seeking to escape responsibility for his actions and crimes that he committed. And on February 15th, the court reconvened to hear the verdict, and Jeffrey was ruled to be sane and not suffering from a mental disease at the time of each of his 15 murders that he was tried for. Although in each count, 2 of the 12 jurors signified their dissent. On the first 2 counts, Jeffrey was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 10 years, with the remaining 13 counts carrying a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment plus 70 years. The death penalty was not an option for Judge Graham to consider as a penalty phase, as Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment in 1853. Upon hearing of his sentencing, his father and stepmother requested to be allowed a 10-minute private meeting with their son before he was transferred to Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage to begin his sentence. The request was granted, and the trio exchanged hugs and well wishes before Jeffrey was escorted away. 3 months after his conviction in Milwaukee, Jeffrey was extradited to Ohio to be tried for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. And in that court hearing, it lasted only 45 minutes, and Jeffrey had again pleaded to guilty to the charges and was sentenced to his 16th term of life imprisonment on May 1st of 1992. So after he was sentenced to prison for life, Jeffrey was then transferred to Columbia Correctional Institute for the first year of his incarceration. He was placed in solitary confinement because there were concerns for his physical safety should he come in contact with some fellow inmates in the prison. With Jeffrey's consent, after a year of solitary confinement, he transferred to a less secure unit, where he was assigned a 2-hour daily work detail cleaning the toilet blocks of the prison. Shortly after completing his lengthy confession in 1991, Jeffrey had requested Detective Murphy to be given a copy of the Bible. Oh, he requested to Detective Murphy to be given a copy of the Bible. This request was granted, and Jeffrey began to gradually devote himself to Christianity and became a born-again Christian while in prison. And on his father's urging, he also read creationist books from the Institute of Creation Research. And in May of 1994, Jeffrey was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a member in the Church of Christ and a graduate of Oklahoma Christian University, in the prison whirlpool. After he was baptized, Ratcliffe had visited Jeffrey on a weekly basis up until November of 1994. Jeffrey and Ratcliffe regularly discussed the prospect of death, and Jeffrey questioned whether he was sinning against God by continuing to live. Referring to his crimes back in 1994 interview with Stone Phillips on Dateline, Jeffrey had stated that if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep within acceptable ranges? That's how he thought anyway. Then in July of that same year, 1994, a fellow inmate, Osvaldo Dorothy, attempted to kill Jeffrey Dahmer by slashing his throat with a razor embedded into a toothbrush, as Jeffrey had returned to his cell from Ratcliffe's weekly service conducted in the prison's chapel. Jeffrey then received superficial wounds from the attack, and he was not seriously hurt by the incident at all. And according to Jeffrey's family, he had been long ready to die and accepted any punishment which he might endure in prison. In addition to his father and stepmother maintaining regular contact, Jeffrey's mother actually also maintained regular contact with her son, although prior to him being arrested, the two had really not spoken to each other since Christmas of 1983. His mother related that in her weekly phone calls, whenever she expressed concerns over Jeffrey's safety and physical well-being, Jeffrey responded with comments to the effect of, "It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me." So later in that same year of 1994, on November 28th, Jeffrey had left his cell to conduct his assigned work detail. Accompanying him were two fellow inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scraver. The trio were left unsupervised in the showers of the prison gym for approximately 20 minutes. And at approximately 8:10 a.m., Jeffrey was discovered on the floor of the bathrooms in the gym suffering from extreme head and facial wounds. He had severely been bludgeoned about the head and the face with a 20-inch metal bar. His head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall in the assault. And although Jeffrey was still alive whenever he was found and he was rushed to a nearby hospital, he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. And Anderson had also been beaten with the same instrument, and he died 2 days later of his wounds. Scraver was serving a life sentence for a murder that was committed in 1990. He informed authorities he had first attacked Jeffrey with the metal bar as Jeffrey was cleaning a staff locker room, before he had went on to attack Anderson as Anderson was cleaning an inmate locker room. And according to Scraver, Jeffrey did not yell or make any noise as he was being attacked. Immediately after attacking both men, Scraver, who was thought to be schizophrenic, he then went back to his cell and informed the prison guard what he had done. And his exact words were, this is a quote, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead," were his exact words to the guard. Scraver was adamant he had not planned the attacks in advance, although he later divulged to investigators he had concealed the 20-inch bar used to kill both men inside of his clothing shortly before the killings happened. Upon learning of his death, Jeffrey's mom responded angrily to the media. Not now is everybody happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death? Is that good enough for everyone? The response of the families of Jeffrey's victims was mixed. Although it appears most were pleased with his death, the district attorney who prosecuted Jeffrey cautioned against turning Scraver into a folk hero, noting that Jeffrey Dahmer's death was still a murder. Still killed somebody. And on May 15th of 1995, Scraver was sentenced to 2 additional terms of life imprisonment for the murders of Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. And although Scraver confessed in 1994 to having concealed the weapon used to kill Jeffrey and Anderson in his clothing on the morning of the murders, in 2015 he publicly stated that the murders of Jeffrey and Anderson were resulted from a confrontation in which one of the 2 men had poked him in the back as the 3 had begun their assigned work detail. In this renewed account of the events, Scraver claimed that the 2 had laughed at him when he had turned around in response before Jeffrey and Anderson each walked to their separate rooms and began their cleaning duties, with Scraver following Jeffrey toward the staff locker room. Scraver alleges that after he had finished murdering Dahmer, he immediately before murdering Jeffrey, he immediately had cornered him, presenting a newspaper article detailing Jeffrey's crimes, and demanded that Jeffrey answer whether that all the accounts were true. He then alleged that he was been revolted by Jeffrey's crimes and that Jeffrey had been openly unrepentant, and that Jeffrey taunted prison employees and fellow inmates by shaping his prison food into imitations of severed limbs, complete with the ketchup to simulate blood splattering. And that the prison staff, knowing of Scraver's hatred for Dahmer, had deliberately left the 2 men unsupervised so that he could kill him. And then he further went on to state that Jeffrey was so disliked by fellow inmates that he required a personal escort to at least one guard, wherever he was out of his cell, to prevent someone from attacking him. Jeffrey had stated in his will that he had wished no service to be conducted and that he wished to be cremated. So in September of 1995, Jeffrey's body was cremated and his ashes were divided between his parents. After Jeffrey was caught on August 5th of 1991, as the nature and the scale of everything that Jeffrey had done came to light, they held a candlelit vigil to celebrate and heal the Milwaukee community that was affected by all of Jeffrey's crimes. And it was attended by more than 400 people. There were community leaders, gay rights activists, family members of several of his victims that were present at the vigil whenever it occurred. An organizer stated that they did the vigil was, the reason why they held the vigil was to enable Milwaukeeans to just come together and share their feelings of pain and anger over what had happened. And the Oxford Apartments at 924 25th Street, where Jeffrey had killed 12 of his victims, was demolished in 1992 of November of 1992. And this lot is now a vacant lot. And they had made plans to convert the site into either a memorial garden of some sort, a playground, or to reconstruct new housings, but they have yet to materialize. Jeffrey's estate was awarded to the families of 11 of his victims who sued for the damages caused by Jeffrey's crimes. And in 1996, Thomas Jacobson, a lawyer representing the 8 of the families, announced that he planned to auction off Jeffrey's estate. And even though victims' relatives stated that the motivation was not greed, the announcement of this spiked serious controversy among the community. A civil group known as the Milwaukee Civic Pride was quickly established in an effort to raise the funds to purchase and destroy Jeffrey's possessions. The group pledged $407,225, including a $100,000 gift by Milwaukee real estate developer Joseph Ziebler for the purchase of Jeffrey's estate. 5 of the 8 families represented by Jacobson agreed to the terms, and Jeffrey's possessions were subsequently destroyed and buried in an undisclosed Illinois landfill. Jeffrey's dad is retired, and he lives with his second wife, Sherry. Both have refused to change their surnames and have professed their love of Jeffrey in spite of his crimes. And in 1994, Lionel published a book, A Father's Story, and he donated part of the proceeds from this book to the victims' families of Jeffrey. And most of the families had showed support of Jeffrey's father and his stepmother, although 3 of those families subsequently sued Jeffrey's father for using the names in the book without obtaining prior consent from the families to have them included in the book. And in a third family, that of Stephen Hicks, they filed a wrongful death suit against Jeffrey's dad, mom, and stepmom, citing that parental negligence as the cause of their claim. Jeffrey's mom died of cancer in November of 2000. Prior to her death, she had attempted suicide at least on 1 occasion. Jeffrey's younger brother, David, changed his surname and lives in anonymity. So, I mean, that's a lot of stuff that we went over, guys. And it's crazy to think that he was able to get away with these murders for so long. He killed 17 people from 1978 to 1991. That's insane to think about. And then 3 years after that, he was killed by a fellow inmate before he could finish serving out his life sentence. So this man was able, I'm not 100% sure how, but this man was able to get away with all these crimes for all this time, and it seemed as though that there was just no repercussions for him to, like, at all whatsoever. Because if you think about it, they had many chances to put him behind bars. Very many. He had been arrested multiple times for multiple occurrences of being indecent around kids. You know, they even had 2 police officers who caught him with one of his victims, Conorak. But yet, no one investigated at all. No one looked him up. They didn't so much as give him a second look. They allowed, in a way, those 2 police officers that stopped him and Conorak whenever Conorak escaped out of his house did a very big injustice to that young man. That was not fair. That was not okay. It was completely and utterly unfair to him, and it should not have been allowed. There's no reason why he should have been able to get away with it for as long as he did. I mean, it's just mind-boggling that he was just able to just do this for as long as he did with no repercussions besides a couple fines and suspended sentences. Like, he would have killed, even if he was not caught fully the first time, if he would have had to start doing prison time, it would have kept him from killing 17 people. Victim count could have been way lower. And especially the last one, like, especially Conorak. With that situation, they should have literally done something. They should have investigated further, like, more than just popping their head in the bedroom. They should have investigated more. Regardless of if he said that that was his lover, boyfriend, whatever, they should have investigated way more than what they did. And they did Conorak a major injustice by not properly investigating. They could have saved that man's life. But because of their lack of investigation into the women's claim, Jeffrey Dahmer was allowed to get away with those murders even more than what he already was. It could have ended right there. And that's just my personal opinion. If they would have even remotely took what those women were saying into consideration, Jeffrey Dahmer could have been stopped then and there. But they didn't. They were just like, okay, yeah, that's your boyfriend, that's fine. We'll just go with that. And I mean, even his landlord at some point could have investigated and noticed something and went to his apartment and done something about it, and he could have been caught then. It's just, to me, it's like he had so many opportunities to be caught as I was researching this case, which is just freaking mind-boggling to me as I read and I saw how many opportunities they had to stop this man, and he was able to just keep by and just continually to get away with it, which frustrates me to no end. And every time I started looking at these cases and I'm going over this stuff, it stresses me out so much to think about the way that these people are able to just convince these people that they're not doing anything, like they're just normal people and they can just get away with it. And I mean, this just goes to show that how charismatic he was and how he was just able to manipulate people and make people trust him. And he was known to be a loner and not really talkative and uncommunicative, but he was still able to convince these men to go home with him. You know, like, it's crazy to me. So with all that, I hope to see all of you guys in the video at the bottom in the comment section. I expect to see all you guys. I hope that you guys can start having an open discussion. If I missed anything in the case, please in the comments feel free to let me know if I missed something. I'm also gonna link in the description box the articles that I used to get the information that I went over in this case. Make sure to like this video, give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure that you you subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you like this video, turn on those post notifications so you know the next time I upload a new video, of course. And if you'd like, come check out my Twitch. We're gonna be doing some true crime episodes on there as well. Videos that I'm not gonna post, cases that I'm not gonna post on this channel, I'm gonna do on True Crime Tuesdays on my Twitch channel. So I hope to see all you guys there, and I really can't wait for us to do our next case. If you have any case suggestions you want to see, please make sure you go into the link in the description and check out my Discord and go to the case selection channel, and you send me some case selections so we have stuff to go over on our next video. And remember, guys, stay awesome, stay beautiful, and above everything else, always stay smiling. Bye guys, have a good day. Bye.